My parents stole $120K for their weddings, but when my grandparents sued them, they had to sell everything and pay with interest for 5 years. I'm 28 years old. I work in digital marketing in Chicago. And I need to tell this story because what my parents did to me basically forced me to rebuild my entire life from scratch, and until recently, I didn't even know half of what really happened. I guess I should start from the beginning, when I was like 8 years old and my parents started fighting. You know, those ugly fights where they yell and throw things, and you hide in your room with a pillow over your head trying not to hear. I don't remember exactly when it all started, honestly. But what I do remember perfectly is the sound of plates breaking against the kitchen wall, and my mother, Barbara, screaming at my father, Kenneth, that he was useless and that she deserved better. We lived in a small town in Ohio, one of those places where everyone knows everyone and your business is everyone's business. So basically the whole neighborhood knew my parents hated each other long before they decided to get divorced. My father worked at a factory, or, well, he worked until they laid him off when I was like 9, I think. And after that, things got much worse. My mother worked at a diner downtown, one of those old places with red vinyl seats and a menu that hadn't changed since the 80 seconds, and she always came home smelling like hamburger grease and cigarettes. I remember that after my father lost his job, he would spend all day at home watching TV and drinking beer, and my mother would come home from the diner and they'd start screaming again about money, about who had ruined their lives, about how they regretted getting married. I was an only child, which honestly made all of this much worse because I didn't have siblings to share the burden with, you know what I mean? It was just me, trapped in the middle of two people who clearly didn't want to be together anymore, but also couldn't just leave. The divorce finally happened when I was 10, and the only thing I can say is that it was ugly, like knockdown, drag-out ugly. There were lawyers, custody battles, accusations from both sides, and they basically used anything as ammunition to hurt each other. In the end, they agreed to joint custody, which meant I spent 1 week with my mother in her tiny apartment near the diner, and the next week with my father in a rental house that smelled like mildew and stale beer. Neither of them really wanted me there. I mean, I could feel it, but they also weren't going to give the other one the satisfaction of keeping me completely. It was like I was just another piece in their mutual revenge game. What I didn't know at the time, and this is important for later, is that my grandparents were basically financing our lives. I have 4 incredible grandparents. Well, I had at that time, all alive and relatively healthy. On my father's side are Raymond and Virginia, who have a small farm outside of town. Nothing fancy, but enough to live comfortably. On my mother's side are Arthur and Ruth, and my grandfather Arthur owns a hardware store in town that's been in the family for like 3 generations. My grandparents were always good to me, you know. They'd take me fishing, bake me cookies, come to my baseball games at school, all those things grandparents are supposed to do. My parents, on the other hand, were so consumed by their mutual hatred that I was basically invisible to them. Fast forward to when I was 15. 16 years old, things didn't improve at all. My mother started dating this guy named Gregory, a used car salesman who thought he was much more interesting than he actually was. And my father was dating Rebecca, a woman like 5 years younger than him who worked at the post office. Neither of them talked to me much about their new relationships. Like, I found out about things because I'd see them together, or because I'd overhear phone conversations, but they never sat me down to say, "Hey, I'm seeing someone new. What do you think?" It was like I was a piece of furniture in their lives, something they had to tolerate but not really consider. When it came time to apply to colleges, my grandparents were the ones who helped me with everything. My parents basically said, "Do whatever you want. We don't have money to pay for your college anyway." Which, okay, fair. They didn't have money, but they didn't even offer to help me fill out applications or review my essays or anything. It was my grandparents, all 4 of them, who sat with me at Raymond and Virginia's kitchen table and helped me complete the FAFSA, write my essays, research scholarships. I remember my grandmother, Ruth, cried when I got accepted to Ohio State, and my parents basically said, "Oh, that's nice," like I was telling them I'd found $1 on the street. When I left for college at 18, I thought I was finally going to be free from all the family drama. My mother drove me to campus in her old car that made a weird noise every time she accelerated, helped me carry my stuff up to the dorm, and then basically said, "Well, I guess this is it. Take care. And left. My father didn't even come. Said he had to work, even though I knew he was unemployed at the time. My grandparents all came, all four of them, and took me to eat at an Italian restaurant near campus and told me how proud they were of me. Honestly, they were the only ones who acted like my going to college was something important. The first 2 years at Ohio State were good. I mean, academically difficult, but good in the sense that I was away from my parents and could kind of reinvent myself. I made friends, dated a few girls, joined a debate club, all those things you do in college. My roommate, Nathan, became my best friend, and he came from a super close-knit family where his parents literally called him every day to ask how he was. I talked to my parents maybe once a month, and those conversations lasted like 5 minutes and were super awkward. I talked to my grandparents every week, though, and they always wanted to know everything about my classes and my social life and whether I was eating well, and then we get to the event that basically blew everything up. I was 20, in my second year of college, and one day I'm scrolling on Facebook, procrastinating instead of studying for a statistics exam, and I see wedding photos. Not wedding photos of a friend or a cousin. No, wedding photos of my mother. My mother had gotten married to Gregory and hadn't invited me. She hadn't even told me she was getting married. There were like 50 photos. Her in a white dress that frankly was very inappropriate for a 8-year-old woman. Gregory in a cheap suit. A bunch of people from town that I knew. And I wasn't in any photo because I wasn't there. They hadn't invited me to my own mother's wedding. I called my mother immediately. My hands were literally shaking as I dialed her number, and when she answered, I just said, "Did you get married?" And she said, like it was nothing, "Oh yeah, it was a small ceremony. We didn't want to make a big fuss." And I said, "But I'm your son. How is it that you didn't invite me?" And she sighed, like that sigh you do when someone's bothering you with something insignificant, and said, "Joshua, don't take it personally. We just wanted something intimate with close people." Close people. Like I, her only son, wasn't close people. I hung up the phone because if I kept talking, I was going to start screaming or crying, and neither of those options seemed acceptable to me. But wait, it gets worse. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks, I get a call from my father, and my father never called me, so I already knew something was up. I answer, and he says, "I need to tell you something." And I think, okay, maybe he's going to apologize about Mom. Maybe he's going to say that he does want to be in my life. But no, he tells me, "I married Rebecca last weekend. And before you start complaining, let me explain something. Your mother and I have been talking, and we both agreed that you represent a part of our lives that we want to leave behind. You're a reminder of our failed marriage, and we're both trying to move on. So no, I didn't invite you to my wedding, and I don't plan on involving you much in my new life with Rebecca. I hope you understand." Can you believe it? My father literally called me to tell me I was a past mistake. He wanted to forget. He said the words, "You're a reminder of our failed marriage." I don't know what you're supposed to say when your father tells you something like that. I just sat there in my dorm room, with Nathan looking at me with a horrified expression because he could hear the whole conversation, and I couldn't even process what had just happened. My father kept talking, saying something about how he hoped we could maintain a cordial but distant relationship, and that maybe we'd see each other at Christmas or something, and then he hung up. He didn't even let me respond. Nathan asked me if I was okay, and honestly, I didn't know what to say. I wasn't okay, obviously, but I also wasn't surprised. You know what I mean? Deep down, I'd always known my parents didn't really want me, but hearing it said out loud that directly was like a punch to the gut. I called my grandparents that night, Raymond and Virginia first, and then Arthur and Ruth, and all of them were furious. My grandmother Virginia cried on the phone and kept saying, "I can't believe Barbara and Kenneth did this. I can't believe it." My grandparents told me they loved me, that I'd always have a place in their lives. All those things your parents are supposed to tell you, but in my case, only my grandparents said. I kept going with college because, honestly, what else was I going to do? I didn't talk to my parents for months after that. They didn't try to contact me either, which kind of confirms everything they'd said. I spent that summer with my grandparents. alternating between Raymond and Virginia's farm and Arthur and Ruth's house in town. I worked at my grandfather, Arthur's, hardware store, helping customers and organizing inventory, and it was honestly one of the best summers of my life despite all the family drama. My grandparents treated me like I was the most important thing in the world, and that helped me not feel completely destroyed by my parents' rejection. I went back to college for my third year, and things were okay, I guess. I was focused on my classes, on getting internships, on basically building a life that had nothing to do with my parents. And then, one day in October, I'm having lunch with my grandparents at a restaurant near campus. All four of them had driven like an hour and a half to visit me, and my grandfather Raymond says, "Joshua, we need to talk to you about something." And I think, oh no, someone's sick. Someone's going to die. And I start to panic. But no, what they told me was much more complicated than that. Turns out, when I got accepted to Ohio State, my four grandparents got together and decided they wanted to help me pay for college. I knew this. I knew they were helping me with some money here and there, but what I didn't know was the actual amount. Between the four of them, they had put together like $80,000 for my education. $80,000. And since I was a minor when I started college, technically that money had to go through my parents. So my grandparents gave the money to my parents in the form of a loan, with a written agreement that the money would be used exclusively for my education and that they would pay it back in small installments with very low interest. And you know what my parents did with that money? They didn't use it for my education. Not 1 cent. Instead, my mother used her half to remodel her apartment and buy Gregory a new car for his used car business. My father used his half to pay off gambling debts he had, debts I didn't even know existed, and to buy Rebecca an expensive engagement ring. And meanwhile, I was in college working 3 part-time jobs, taking out student loans, basically living off ramen and peanut butter because I thought I didn't have money for college. My grandparents had been asking my parents about the money, about how my education was going, and my parents kept lying to them saying everything was fine, that the money was being used correctly. My grandparents finally discovered the truth when my grandmother Ruth called the Ohio State Administration office to ask about my tuition balance, and they told her I owed thousands of dollars and was paying for everything with student loans and my own money. She called my other grandparents. They investigated more and discovered that my parents had basically stolen the $80,000. When my grandparents told me this, I literally couldn't process the information. I just sat there in that Italian restaurant with a plate of spaghetti getting cold in front of me, trying to understand how my own parents could do something like that. My grandfather Arthur said, "We're going to sue them. Joshua, we're going to get that money back." And honestly, I didn't know if I wanted them to because, despite everything, they were still my parents, you know? But my grandparents were determined. They said it wasn't just about the money, although the money obviously mattered, but about the principle of the thing. Barbara and Kenneth had stolen, they had lied, they had betrayed the trust of the whole family, and they couldn't just get away with it. The confrontation happened like 2 weeks later. My grandparents organized a meeting at the same diner where my mother worked, because according to my grandfather Raymond, they wanted to do this in a public place so my parents couldn't make a scene. I didn't want to go, honestly, but my grandparents said it was important for me to be there. So I went, drove the 2 hours back to my hometown on a Saturday morning, and walked into that diner with my 4 grandparents while my mother was working her shift. My mother saw us walk in, and her face went pale immediately. My father was already sitting there in a booth, because apparently my grandparents had summoned him too. Kenneth looked terrible, honestly, like he hadn't slept in days, and he had this cornered animal expression. My grandfather Arthur got straight to the point, stood in front of the table and said, "Barbara, Kenneth, we want to talk about the $80,000 we lent you for Joshua's education. Where is that money?" My mother tried to act confused, saying, "What are you talking about?" That money was used for Joshua's college, obviously. But my grandmother Ruth pulled out a folder full of documents, bank statements, records of calls to Ohio State, all kinds of evidence they had collected, and put it on the table. She said, "Don't lie, Barbara. We know exactly what you did." My father didn't even try to deny it, just sat there with his head down, and finally said, I'm sorry. We got into financial trouble and we thought we could pay it back before anyone noticed. But the part that hurt me the most was when my grandfather Raymond asked my father, "How could you do this to your own son?" And my father looked up, looked directly at me, and said, "He was going to be fine anyway. He always figures things out." As if the fact that I could survive justified stealing $80,000 from me. My mother started crying, that manipulative kind of crying I'd seen a million times, and said, "We're going to pay it back. We promise. Just give us time." But my grandparents had already made a decision. My grandfather Arthur said, "You have two options. You pay us back the full amount with interest in the next 30 days, or we sue you. And we're not playing." Obviously, my parents didn't have $80,000 to pay back in 30 days. They didn't even have $8,000. So my grandparents proceeded with the lawsuit. They hired a lawyer, a good one from Cleveland, who specialized in family fraud, and basically put together a case so solid that my parents couldn't even defend themselves properly. The legal process took like 6 months, during which I was trying to focus on my last year of college, but was constantly getting calls and emails about depositions and hearings. And here's where the story takes a turn that honestly made me feel a little bad for my parents, though not much. Rebecca, my father's wife, found out about the whole lawsuit thing and basically said, "I'm not going to stay with a man who steals from his own son," and she left him. She just packed her things and left, and my father was left alone in that rental house that smelled like mildew. Gregory, my mother's husband, also left, but for a different reason. Apparently, he had invested money in the apartment my mother remodeled with the stolen money, and when he found out that money came from a loan they now had to pay back with interest, he basically said, "This is fraud and I'm not going to be part of it." And he left too. My parents lost their jobs too. My mother was fired from the diner because the owner was friends with my grandmother Ruth and basically said she didn't want to have someone working there who had done that to their family. My father, who had finally gotten another job at a different factory, was also fired when his employer found out about the lawsuit. In small towns, news travels fast. You know what I mean? And basically the whole community found out that Barbara and Kenneth had stolen from their own son and their parents. The case finally settled out of court. My grandparents' lawyer basically told my parents, "You can go to trial and lose publicly and probably face criminal fraud charges, or you can agree to a settlement now." My parents agreed to the settlement. They had to sell everything they had of value: their cars, furniture, jewelry, anything that could be sold. My mother had to sell her apartment. My father had to sell a vintage motorcycle he'd had for years, and that apparently was the only thing he really valued. Between everything, they raised like $45,000, which obviously wasn't enough. The final agreement was that they'd pay the $45,000 immediately, and then pay the rest in monthly installments of $500 for the next 5 years, with interest. They also had to write formal apology letters, not just to my grandparents but also to me, acknowledging what they had done and accepting complete responsibility. The letters I received were weird. My mother wrote like 3 pages about how difficult her life had been, about how the divorce had left her in a terrible financial position, about how Gregory had pressured her to remodel the apartment, basically trying to justify her actions even while apologizing. My father wrote like half a page saying, "I'm sorry for what I did. It was selfish and unforgivable. I don't expect your forgiveness." His letter was more honest, I guess, but also colder. After everything was legally resolved, my grandparents insisted there should be some kind of family meeting, like to close the cycle or whatever. I really didn't want to, but my grandparents, especially my grandmother Virginia, said it was important for family healing. So we organized another meeting at the same diner, like 6 months after the settlement, and this time it was much more awkward than the original confrontation. My parents arrived together, which was weird because I hadn't seen them in the same place voluntarily in years. They both looked older, more tired, like defeated. My mother had lost weight, not in a healthy way, but in a way that makes you think she's not eating well. My father had more gray hair, more wrinkles, and this look in his eyes like resignation. We sat in a big booth. My grandparents, my parents, and me, and for the first 10 minutes nobody said anything. It was my grandmother Ruth who finally broke the silence and said, "Well, We're all here, so someone should say something. My mother started crying again and said, Joshua, I know I can't fix what I did. I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to hate me. I just want you to know, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. My father just nodded and said, what she said. I looked at both of them and honestly didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to yell at them, tell them they'd ruined my life, that they'd stolen not just money but also the chance to have a normal family. But another part of me just felt sorry for them, because it was obvious their lives were a mess and probably always would be. I told them, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you completely for this. You didn't just steal money from me. You stole my childhood. You stole the possibility of having parents who actually cared about me. You left me out of your weddings, called me a past mistake, and then you stole from me. So no, I don't think we can ever have a normal relationship again. But for the sake of the grandparents, I can be civil with you. I can show up at family gatherings and be cordial, but that's all I can offer right now. My parents accepted that, basically because they had no other choice. We ate in uncomfortable silence. My grandparents trying to make casual conversation about the weather and town events, and I just wanted it to be over. After that meal, I drove back to Ohio State, and that was like the last time I really talked to my parents in any meaningful way. I graduated from Ohio State 6 months after all this drama. My 4 grandparents were there at the ceremony, shouting and clapping when they said my name, taking like 100 photos. My parents weren't invited. I got a job in digital marketing in Chicago almost immediately after graduating, and I moved there to start my real life, away from the town, away from the drama, away from everything. Now, 2 years later, things are good, I guess. I work at a marketing agency that pays decently. I live in a small but comfortable apartment in Logan Square. I have a girlfriend named Emily who comes from a normal, loving family that makes me feel welcome every time I visit them. My grandparents come to visit me every few months, and I go to Ohio to visit them when I can. My relationship with them became even stronger after all this, if that's possible. My parents are still paying the monthly installments to my grandparents. As far as I know, they have like 2 more years left. My mother got a job at another diner in a neighboring town. My father is working at a warehouse. Neither of them remarried. I talk to them maybe twice a year, short calls on Christmas and my birthday, where the conversation is cordial but empty. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive them completely, and honestly, I don't know if I want to. What I do know is that I learned who really cares about me and who doesn't. I learned that family isn't always the people you share blood with, but the people who show up when you need them most. My grandparents saved me, literally and figuratively, and I'll make sure they know how grateful I am every day I have left with them. Last a week, my grandfather Raymond called to tell me he wants to start teaching me how to run the farm because, even though I'm 28 and live in Chicago, he wants me to know how to do things in case I ever want to come back someday. And I told him yes, I'd love to learn, even though honestly I have no plans to return to Ohio permanently. But the fact that he wants to include me in that, the fact that all my grandparents have always treated me like I was the most important thing in their lives, that's what really matters. Not the money, not the forced apologies from my parents, but knowing there are people who genuinely love me. And that, I guess, is enough for now.